Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome back to the Visibility Project podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee. Spearheaded by the members of the Cultural Awareness Coalition, the project is the brainchild of several organizations and individuals with shared values who sit on a project steering team. We hope that the podcast series creates a deeper empathy for others and serves as a catalyst for people to actively create a more inclusive community and world.
In this month's episode, we'll be focusing on the voices of the indigenous community and the Anishinaabe community in particular. We will be exploring their history and culture with Sierra Clark, who serves as the lone full-time Indigenous Affairs reporter in Michigan. Sierra is Kichi Wikwidong Singh Odawa from the Grand Traverse Band of Odawa and Ojibwe. She currently resides on her ancestral homelands of the Grand Traverse Bay in northern Michigan with her husband and 2 children. She graduated from Western Michigan University in 2019 with a degree in freshwater science and sustainability. In 2020, she made a big career change from being a freshwater biologist when she started as a journalist fellow with the Michigamming Journalism Project. In the partnership between the Traverse City Record Eagle and Indigenizing the News, she collaborated partnerships between the newsrooms and reported on Anishinaabe stories in Michigan. She's been featured in The Kitchen, Detroit Metro Times, Michigan Radio, Planet Detroit, Interlochen Public Radio, and many other publications in her first year as a journalist. She currently works for the Traverse City Record Eagle as the Indigenous Affairs reporter through Report for America, where she covers Indigenous sovereign nations in northern Michigan. She also sits as the co-editor for Indigenizing the News. Well, welcome, Sierra. I'm so happy to have you here on the Visibility Project podcast with us today. So the first things first, I'd love to learn more about you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, Anin, bonjour, hello. Sierra Indigenous, Kichiwikwidong, Sing, Dojaba, Odawa, Ojibwe, Nda, Makwa, and Doram. Hello all, my name is Sierra Clark. I am from the Grand Traverse Bay region of my ancestral homelands here in northern Michigan. I am Odawa, Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, and I am Bear Clan.
Excellent. So thank you for being here. And I'm so excited to learn more from you today. So in addition to that, so I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about your work today, but can you tell me some things that things that you are just passionate about? Maybe they can let us know a little bit more about you. What are things that may get you up in the morning, I guess?
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot.
Coffee, right?
Yeah, definitely coffee. Nibi. So Nibi in our language means water. And that's actually kind of where I started my path, was my passion and my traditional role as an Anishinaabe Kwe is to be a water protector and to care for that water. But I also have a lot of interest in environmental issues, protecting the sacred, as we call it, and thinking 7 generations ahead. So, how will my impact affect, my great-great-grandchildren? So that's something that I carry with me throughout my work, but also in my personal life. But besides that, I'm just an, average northern Michigan kind of gal. I like fishing. I like, hiking and camping, being in the outdoors.
Excellent. Yeah, you and me both there. So speaking of, you're so passionate about that. And I love this idea that, thinking about your great-great-grandchildren. Is this typically, and I know you're of Anishinaabe, so is this an Anishinaabe, or is this really more indigenous people's thought processes and thinking about the future more than the present? Is that?
I can't speak on behalf of other indigenous peoples of the world, but I know that an Anishinaabe culture that is strongly rooted in our beliefs and how we practice ourselves is thinking of 7 generations ahead. And it's the way that we connect to not only the natural world around us, but in every relationship that we have, because we believe that everything is connected to one another. For example, the tree outside you can't see it, but outside this room, I am no better than that tree, because that tree has every right to be here just as much as I do. And so when we think 7 generations ahead, we're thinking of our actions and the way that we carry ourselves and the work that we do. And that comes from our strong, traditions as Anishinaabe people.
Wonderful. That's really impactful. Now, speaking of impactful, I really want to talk about your work. I think it's so important, so I want to make sure that we highlight it a lot today. You are the state of Michigan's only Indigenous Affairs reporter. So
yeah, the only full-time Indigenous Affairs reporter.
Can you talk about why you decided to be an Indigenous Affairs reporter, and why do you feel like this work is so important?
Yeah, so I kind of fell into it oddly. I was serving as a water quality analyst. I graduated with my degree in freshwater science and sustainability, and I was kind of bouncing around from place to place, working with different organizations and conservations. And I was approached by a journalist. Her name is Kayla Fawn. She has since left journalism, but she asked me last May of 2020 if I would consider becoming a journalist. And I told her, no, I don't trust journalists. I don't trust media. And she said, think about it, because this could be a really good opportunity for you. And so I went to my uncle, and he says the same thing that he always tells me, which is pray on it for 3 days. And I did. And I prayed on it. And I really got to thinking of how especially mainstream media is extractive in Indigenous communities. And I have seen it firsthand, even in, the company that I work for. I have seen it firsthand where they go into my community and they extract a story without really involving themselves in the community or, learning the culture or the traditions. And so after I was done praying on it, I said, maybe I could help bridge those gaps. And I found myself as a journalist fellow for the Michigamming Journalism Project, partnership between the Traverse City Record Eagle and Indigenizing the News. And it kind of just took off. It took off in really unexpected ways. Since then, it's kind of been a whirlwind.
Well, I'm so glad that you did, because you have unearthed as a reporter, some really impactful stories. One of those that I know about, and I would love for you to share more of your most prominent and most important stories to you that you feel are. But one that I know of is you, for lack of a better word, you unearthed your family's history, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you tell me more about this experience of unearthing your family's history and what this was, what your work was around with this situation?
For a little over a year now, I have been, I guess you could say, quote unquote, investigating residential boarding schools. And in the state of Michigan, there are 3 known boarding schools. There might be 2 more, but I can't confirm or deny that at the moment. But it started off with just talking about Orange Shirt Day last September, which is on September 30th, I believe, a day to you remember residential boarding school victims and those who may not have survived. And upon the news in Canada that happened earlier this spring of them rediscovering mass graves and bodies, I was assigned to dig deeper into Michigan's residential boarding schools. And my family, we always had rumors that we had family that were in schools. We didn't know how far back that was or who it was. Nobody in our family talked about it. We just knew at some point our traditions, our culture, and our language was stripped from us. And so when I pulled records from the Mount Pleasant Industrial Boarding School, I was just going through them, trying to get a better understanding of what was going on. And that's when I uncovered my great-grandfather's name. And then I uncovered his father's name and his sibling's name. And it went back 5 generations. That's only one school. That's only looking at one family line. I haven't begun to look at our family, our other family names on my grandmother's side or Holy Child boarding school. To say that it's been traumatic is a bit of an understatement. It has been conflicting and confusing. And there was probably a good month's period where I could not stop crying. Mourning my family's loss, just having those thoughts of where we could have been if we weren't affected by it.
Right. Well, it's been great because while it's been so hard, I know your family is a part of this. I think it sheds light to some of the atrocities, from many terrible things that happened to the Indigenous community, and not only your family but other families who were impacted. I think that it's while it's so overwhelming almost at times to be able to see your own family's history there. I think it's great to be able to show other families as well and highlight what they've been through. And so I thank you for your work on this, and thank you for talking about it. I know it's not easy to talk about. So
Of course, yeah, and the reason that we put it in first perspective is, as a journalist, you try to separate yourself from the story, but there was no way that I could separate myself from a story that was affecting me. And it was my boss's idea to put it in first person, and I really wanted to convey to non-Indigenous readers that, hey, this is a much, much bigger issue than you may think it is. It affects every Indigenous person that you meet. They are somehow affected. They are either a survivor themselves or a generational survivor. And so I really, really want non-Indigenous readers that, follow these stories to have some compassion and empathy, and realize that many of the struggles that Indigenous people face today is because of these residential boarding schools. The last one in Michigan didn't shut down until the 80s. So this isn't something that happened a long time ago. We're talking about we have living survivors.
And for our listeners who aren't as familiar, what were the purposes of these boarding schools, and what actually did they do, and what was the impact?
So the residential boarding schools was a cheaper way to eradicate what the US government deemed as their Indian problem. They realized that going to war was just too costly, and they kind of figured that if we can eradicate their culture and snip it in the butt at a very young age, it's going to be much cheaper to do it that way. And maybe in a few generations, the Indian problem will be gone. So the sole purpose of these schools, and I'm saying this as both someone who has been researching it and someone who's affected by it, was 100% to assimilate Indigenous children and eradicate the Indian in them. The motto of these schools was to kill the Indian, save the man. And you can listen to the accounts of survivors, and they were stripped of their language, their identity. They were stripped of their names. They were given Christian names or American names. They were, punished for if they were being too Indian.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that it's really important for our listeners and for the larger population to know this history and to realize it happened in our backyard in Michigan, and it's still impacting people. So thank you for sharing. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about couple other stories that you've covered that you feel are also really truly impactful for our listeners to know about?
Yes, of course. So another issue I want to bring up that affects Indian country, as we call it, is MMIW, which it stands for Missing Murdered Indigenous Women. And we've expanded that to also include Girl and Two-Spirit because they are disproportionately affected as well. And that issue holds dear in my heart, as it does many Indigenous people. The DOJ, which is the Department of Justice, found that Indigenous women are 10 times more likely to be murdered than any other demographic. 1 in 4 Indigenous women face sexual assault and violent assault. So as an Indigenous woman and being a survivor of that, it is really important for me to talk about, because this is something that is also happening in our backyard that not a people are aware of. One of the biggest issues is finding data on it. The federal government stopped counting Indigenous women going missing or murdered. We have no idea what the actual number is because they stopped counting. And
That's
something
crazy.
that I do want to highlight is the case of Nagones Massey. Nagones was a 21-year-old mother who was murdered. November of 2020. I was given permission by her mother to talk and, say her name. I don't want to go too much into the case, but it is something that I do urge people to look into as much as they can, because like I said, there isn't a lot of data, and that should be alarming people.
Well, thank you for sharing, and I encourage our listeners to look that up. I know that I'm going to be doing that research myself, so thank you for sharing. Are there any other really truly impactful stories that you would like our listeners to be aware of that you've covered?
Oh, goodness. I think really what I try to do with my stories is bring the idea or the image of the indigenous person into the 21st century. There are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of stereotypes about indigenous people, and part of my work is bridging those gaps, and I hate to say it, but it has to be done normalizing us. Unfortunately, Native Americans, and especially like my community, there is a lot of misinformation, a lot of, like I said, stereotypes. And so I really want readers to just get familiarized with our stories, that it's not all doom and gloom when they read about us. I want them to see the good and see the beautiful culture that we have and the amazing things that, tribal sovereign nations are doing. For example, the Little River Band of Odawa Indians just released 400 baby sturgeon this past summer, and that's the biggest that they've ever done. And it's a project that they started ground up over 10 years ago, and they are they're leading this initiative to bring back a very sacred species that was almost wiped out due to colonization. So yeah, that's just a lot of my work really involves bringing us to the 21st century.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experiences growing up. So can you tell me what it was like growing up in Anishinaabe?
Yeah, so I grew up Anishinaabe, but I did not know what that meant. As I had mentioned before, my family, we were stripped of our language, of our culture, of our traditions. The last traditional woman in our family, Della Smith, my great-grandmother, she passed before she was able to pass on any of those traditions to me or, my cousins. So growing up, I knew I was Native American. I didn't know what it meant though. And I'm mixed. I have a Zaganash, a white father, and my mother is Odawa Ojibwe. And growing up on the reservation, I always kind of felt like an outsider looking in. I would attend powwows, I would attend classes, but I never really felt like I belonged because I was mixed. And the school that I went to was predominantly white, very upper class, and I wasn't accepted by those children either because I was Native American. It wasn't until my early 20s that I really started reconnecting with my Anishinaabe culture and understanding the Three Fire legacy, or the Three Fire Confederacy, and Ojibwe Moen, and our stories and traditions.
Well, wonderful. Yeah, I was going to ask about the traditions your family passed, but unfortunately, it sounds like your grandmother wasn't able to pass those. But I'm very happy to hear that being in your 20s, you've really started to learn and embrace, and it's great. What do you think that you wish more people knew and understood about not only Anishinaabe, but indigenous people in general? What are some things that you wish the rest of the population knew about your culture?
We are not monoliths. And that is something that Hollywood really kind of put into the minds of American society, is romanticizing Great Plains Indians. Majority of the time when someone tells me, you don't look Indian, I have to look at them like, well, yeah, of course I'm not running around in a buckskin with John Wayne, shooting bows and arrows. I'm woodland Anishinaabe, I'm very pale in the winter, very tall. But I really want people to understand that there are over 500 and I believe 76, and I might be wrong on this, but there are over 500 different tribal nations in what is now the United States. And that's just federal recognized. There are more that are not federally recognized. And each of those tribes have different belief systems, different cultural practices, different traditions, different languages. The thing that does tie us in together is our shared oppression unfortunately. What I want people to understand about Anishinaabe people is, not only our resiliency and beauty that we have carried on through 500 years of oppression and genocide, but that we are contemporary people. We are scientists, we're doctors, we're musicians, we're everything and all of those above.
You talk about stepping into the 21st century, but I also want to reflect on what are some points of pride of your ancestral history of the Anishinaabe that once you move in your 20s and you learn more, what are some points of pride for you or Anishinaabe culture in general?
Oh man. So Anishinaabe, specifically, Odawa, Ojibwe of my region, we are still, but we were incredibly smart. And this is, I've learned a lot of this from Eric Hemingway. He is Little Trevor's Bay Band of Odawa. He's their historian and archivist, but we purposely and strategically started learning English and we're sending our children to these not residential boarding schools, but to formal education so that they could read and write and negotiate with the early European settlers. And this actually helped us out quite a bit when it came time to the treaties. I'm not too sure how aware people are of the treaties, but the government lied and they lied again. And they were trying to go back on a lot of the negotiations. And it was because of them being smart and planning ahead and having their children be versed in that reading and writing, that their children were like, no. Treaty says this is where you negotiated, this is where you signed. And that helped us out in the end. And, I'm not too well versed on a lot of our historical figures, but I can say this: Anishinaabe have historically and continue to be resilient and resistant.
Thank you so much for that. Now, this is something that you alluded to a little bit earlier, but there's these stereotypes and misconceptions people have.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there are these misconceptions about the indigenous people in general? And as you mentioned, one being that it's a homogenous group, right? That it's monolithic. But what do you think some of the other misconceptions people hold are, like misconceptions or stereotypes?
Oh yeah, I'll go through like the top ones I get all the time. That we get free money. We do not get free money. Any money that tribal citizens do receive are either back payments from ceded territory, or it's from their own tribal sovereign nation that have built means, such as casinos or hotels, and have been able to profit revenues to give to their tribal members. We get free education. No, we do not. I have over $65,000 in student loan debt.
I feel you there.
Yeah. That we, another misconception is that we can, hunt and fish wherever we please, and that's not true. We're we retained the right to hunt, gather, and fish on our ancestral land. So for example, for me, that would be the 1836 Treaty of Washington. And there are still rules and laws and regulations on, what we're allowed to catch, when we're allowed to catch it, how much we're allowed to catch, etc. And I feel that there's so many misconceptions and stereotypes. And I really do just urge listeners, there's this really great thing that you can do. You can go on Google and type in, whose land am I on? This beautiful website will pop up. You just type in your address, or you just type in the area that you're in, and it will tell you the ancestral homelands that you're residing on. And from there, you can go and Google, back history. But it's really important for listeners and any of my readers to understand that, we are not monolith. We are not all the same. We are very diverse, with very diverse backgrounds and cultures and ideas. And do the research.
Do the research. That's right. So thank you for sharing. Now, another topic that I'd like to address is, you mentioned it's 2021 now, but have you or others in the community been discriminated against personally? And if so, what's been your reaction to those instances?
I learned about racism when I was about, I want to say 5 or 6 years old. It's called the Dirty Indian. I was not allowed to go over to a girl's house because her mother was afraid that I had lice because I was a dirty Indian. And throughout the years, it really broke me down because I had mentioned before that I knew I was Native American. I just didn't understand what it was. And for a really long time throughout my childhood, the majority of my experience on being Native American was negative. And for a really long time, I tried to hide that part of me. I never really talked about my culture, never talked about my background. And I would even make jokes about Native Americans to just try and blend in because I was so afraid that they were going to find out that I was Native. And when I started to come around in my early 20s and kind of reflected on that, I understood that I was giving people the power that didn't deserve it. So now when I get, in my line of job, I do get emails, I do get comments, racism, stereotyping. I sit on it. I allow myself to feel those emotions, but then I remember that they don't know anything about me. And I really just try not to let it affect me.
It can be hard, I'm sure. It's, as you mentioned, it wears on you. It's almost like microaggressions or just straight aggressions, many of them, where they're like little pinpricks over time that eventually add up, like almost mosquito bites, right? It just eventually gets to be too much. So is there something that we can do to build a more inclusive community? What can we as Americans, what can we do? How can we do a better job of recognizing Indigenous people and respecting Indigenous people?
Well, to respect Indigenous people is to listen to them. And it's not listening to them in a way that you're passing over a microphone to them, listening to them in a way that you are standing behind them, holding their back up to make sure that they are supported, they feel supported, so that they can speak their own truths. And that's something that I really, really push, is giving Indigenous people their own voice, which is why I'm in journalism, is to uplift those voices. I don't want to tell their stories for them. Although I'm Indigenous myself, that's not my story to tell. It's their story. But for the other part of the question, I would say definitely ask Indigenous people, such as you guys did yourself, is just asking and being respectful. And I do have to commend you, Jeremiah, especially in the beginning of the show, you asked, is it Indigenous? Is it Native American? And those are the kind of questions that, as an Anishinaabe, that I look for, because you don't know the answer, but you're curious to know the answer. There's no wrong way, if you're being respectful, to just ask those questions.
Thank you for that. And today I think that I've learned so much, and thank you for being here today. What would you say is your final message to our listeners? What would you like to wrap us up with today? What would you like for us to be our takeaway? I know, big one, right?
Yeah, something along the lines of support Indigenous voices, support Indigenous, I don't like to call them activists because they're not. They are land defenders and water defenders. But to be an ally is to listen. And the best way that you can be an ally is, like I said, to just support those who are trying to speak.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today, Sierra. It was truly a pleasure, and I learned so much from you today. So thank you.
Miigwech.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.